Hello. Now we are going to look at how we gather data and some of the problems that we can come across when we try to gather it. The general name for gathering data and understanding it is surveying. And we can survey information in lots of different ways. We could do in-person interviews, we could give out questionnaires and do questionnaires over the internet, or we could run experiments. And there's lots of other ways of gathering as well. So surveying is something we often use in English to mean a questionnaire, but there are lots of different ways of surveying information or gathering information and trying to understand it. So a popular way of surveying information is to give out questionnaires, lists of questions that we're interested in to see if we can get answers from people. When we're writing questionnaires, it's very important that we keep the questions short and clear. We don't want to have big blocks of text when we are doing our questionnaires so that people understand the questions and so they will read through them and answer them. When we're writing the questions, we also want to think about what type of information is this going to give us? Are we going to get numbers that we would be able to do more analysis with? Are we just going to get yes and no type answers? And that will affect the type of interpretation, the type of understanding we can get from our data. When we're writing our questionnaires, we want to be very careful to avoid personal questions or emotionally charged wording. We would never write, "Are you fat? Yes, no," in a questionnaire, because we're not going to get useful answers. This is just going to irritate people, and we're not going to get answers that people are comfortable to give. This is obviously a very extreme example, but it's easy if we don't check our questions with other people, get other people to read the questions that we write. They may be unclear or they may come across poorly. So we want to make sure that we make people as comfortable as possible when they're answering our questions so that they're going to answer them as honestly as possible. We also want to avoid leading questions. So if we have a question like this, are politicians paid too much? There is a bias to this question that would make people go, yes, politicians are paid too much. We are priming the person, we're effectively leading the person to give an answer that we want. One of the ways that we can help with getting answers that are useful to us is to have very standardized ways of giving answers, like the boxes that we have down here. So answer boxes that restrict the ways that people can answer, like yes, no boxes, or here where we have different age groups is what this is supposed to be. So 0 to 9, 10 to 19, 20 to 29, 29 to 39. These different groups, we can get people to answer very quickly, and we can group people together very easily. Groups like this are also helpful. Instead of having a very direct question like what we were talking about here that people can feel personal about, how old someone is can also be a personal question for some people. So giving groups like this, where they're in broader categories, makes people more comfortable with answering questions. So we would generally try to avoid things like age or weight that people might be uncomfortable with, and instead give them groups like this. And the groups are broad enough that we get useful information, but they feel comfortable answering. Now, what may jump out at you is there is a problem with one of the groups here. If a person was 29 years old, would they go in this group or in this group? So when we are creating our groups for our standard answers, we need to be very careful that we don't have overlapping groups. If we look at the rule we've been using for the other groups, we would say the 29 should not be here. This 29 should actually be starting at 30 in the same way as we started at 10 and 20. So when we're creating those groups, we just need to be mindful that none of our groups overlap, that a 29-year-old would know they go in this group and a 30-year-old would go in this group. So that's how we would be creating questionnaires. We, again, can also be trying to figure out how to structure an interview and how we would make people comfortable to answer the questions. Or if we're running experiments, do we have controls, and are we keeping only one thing being varied at a time? There's lots of different structures we need to make sure we get data that's useful to us. Now, where would we get our data from? Well, if we're looking at questionnaires and interviews, we'd be looking at populations of people. So a population is just the group we want to study. It could be all of the people in a country, it could be all of the people in a school, but the population is the group we want to understand better, that we want to gather data from. And if we have the resources, we can run a census, which is a questionnaire where we ask everyone in the population to answer some questions. Now, this is great because everyone in our population, ideally, is able to give us answers, so we get loads of data. We know exactly where everybody in the population is on the topics we want to know about. The problem is it's very difficult to ask everyone in a country a question. Even to ask everyone in a school a bunch of questions would be difficult. So to do a census takes a huge amount of resources. It can be very helpful, but it's very difficult to run. So we often aren't able to run a census where we ask everyone in a population. Instead, we try to pick smaller groups of people within the population that we can ask questions to, and we try to make sure that they're as random as possible so that we get a good idea of what everyone in the population thinks by asking a few people randomly selected from the population, so that hopefully on average we're still getting a good idea of what the overall population thinks. And these smaller groups that we ask questions to are called samples. So a sample, again, is the smaller group in a population. We want a small group to make it convenient to run our experiment, to ask our questionnaires or to ask our questions to. But we also want it to be as big as we're able to run, because the bigger the group, the more representative it's probably going to be of our population. If we can keep it random and keep it big, then our sample is more likely to tell us about the overall population. The most extreme example is if we only ask one person, we're unlikely to get an idea of what the overall population thinks. If we ask 10,000 people, we're much more likely to get a feel for what the overall population thinks. So the sample group has to be small to be manageable, but we want it to be as big as we're able to run it with to get the best idea of what the overall population thinks. In terms of selecting our sample, we can just pick people at random from the population. This can be very difficult, a little bit like the census can be very difficult, because we need access to everyone in the population. If we ring up people in the phone book, not everyone is going to answer the phone. If we try to email people, we need access to that type of contact information. So how do we randomly contact lots of people in the population? So instead of just randomly asking people in a big population, we tend to have to break the population up into different subgroups and try and target our questions towards them. So this is called a stratified sample. So instead of just asking anyone in the population, what we try to do is narrow our focus, and we're going to ask subgroups within the population. We break up the population by age, so younger people, working age people, retired people, something like that. We can break people up by gender identity, or we could break them up by location. So we narrow the population down, and then we try, because it's a smaller group and easier to manage, we see if we can do random sampling within those smaller groups, and we try to keep the proportions correct. So if we were dealing with a situation where we broke up the country, say, by location, there are an awful lot more people in Dublin than there are in Mayo. So we would ask more people in Dublin than we would in Mayo, so that we got proportionally a better feel for what the population at large thought about things. So we'd try and have proportionally the same, the right number of people for our overall population. Now, what we often do when we're trying to run experiments in school is something called convenience sampling. If I'm asked to run a survey, the easiest way for me to do that is just to ask the people in my class. That's not a very good random sample, because those people might not be representative. So if I'm in first year and I ask the people in my class their opinions on things, I might get very different answers than I would from 5th or 6th years. And I'm not getting a good feel for the overall behavior of the population, because I'm only asking the people who happen to be around me, who are easy for me to get at. So convenient sampling is convenient, but it can be very biased. It can mean that we don't get answers that give a good idea of the overall population. Throughout this, we've touched on the idea of bias a few times, and bias comes into every level of gathering data. So it can come in when we're talking about sampling. Very fundamentally, if we don't think carefully enough about who is involved in our population, then we can miss out an awful lot of people. If we're running a survey about opinions on uniform, say in a school, and we only ask the staff in the school, then we don't get a very good idea of what the overall population thinks. So if we don't bother asking any students about the opinions on uniform, then we're going to get a very biased picture of the opinions on uniform in the population, if the school was our population. So we need to be careful. Have we understood who is in our population, and we're making sure that we're trying to do random sampling of that entire population. It can also be difficult to ask questions if we don't talk to people from a variety of backgrounds. We can end up not realizing that there are questions we should be asking that simply don't occur to us because of our own background. So if all of the people running the experiment or running the questionnaire were women, or if all of them were men, or if all of them were Irish, there are questions that may not occur to people who come from a particular background. So it's important to try and get different people to feed into the experiments and into the data gathering so that we get all of the questions that we really need to ask asked. Are there answers that we don't allow in the way that we give our information? So our standard box answers are very helpful, but they can also have drawbacks. As a bit of a joke type example, if we asked an informal survey after a party, did you enjoy the party? And the only answers that we allow are that it was good, great, or excellent, then we aren't really getting good information from our survey. So we have to be careful that the way we ask the questions and the answers that we allow get a good picture of what the population actually thinks. We also need to keep in mind that people just lie from time to time in surveys and in questionnaires. There's social pressure to give particular types of answers on political questions or on societal questions, and we need to be careful to try and ask the questions in multiple ways if we have to, or be very careful on our wording so that people feel as comfortable as possible to answer as honestly as possible. And leading on from that, and like the biased questions that we had before, the way in which we word questions has a very big impact on the answers that we are going to get, and we have to think about that very carefully when we write our questionnaires or when we do our interviews. If we ask most people, does everyone have the right to vote, or should everyone have the right to vote, most people will instinctively say yes. But if we asked, should teenagers all have the right to vote, many people then change their answer. Everyone would instinctively include teenagers. But if we said, does everyone have the right to vote, or do teenagers have the right to vote, we get different answers. So we have to be very careful about our own bias in asking the question, and about trying to avoid the bias of people and get the most direct and useful answers for the questions we are trying to ask. So those are the different ways that we can gather data, and some of the things we have to think about when we are gathering data. And that is what we need for now.